Alexander the Great stands as one of history's most iconic and enigmatic figures. Born in 356 BCE, he was destined for greatness from the moment of his birth in the royal city of Pella, Macedonia. His father, King Philip II, had already begun the ambitious project of unifying the fractured Greek states, turning Macedonia into a powerful military force. But it was Alexander, with his restless spirit and unparalleled tactical genius, who would propel that vision into something far beyond anything his father had imagined. From an early age, Alexander exhibited traits that set him apart from his peers. He was tutored by Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, who instilled in him a love for learning, science, and philosophy. This education, however, did not make Alexander a mere scholar. He combined the sharp intellect of Aristotle with a natural ability to lead men, command armies, and envision a future that would stretch across continents. But it was not just his mind that made Alexander unique, it was his unshakable belief in his own destiny. He was convinced that he was more than a king. He was a divinely appointed ruler, a conqueror chosen by the gods to reshape the world. It was this belief, perhaps more than any military tactic or political maneuver, that would fuel his extraordinary career. At the age of just 20, when his father was assassinated in 336 BCE, Alexander inherited a kingdom that was poised on the brink of something extraordinary. Macedon was already a formidable power in Greece, but Alexander's ambitions went far beyond mere dominance over the Greek city-states. He intended to conquer Persia, the most powerful empire in the world at the time, and extend his reach into Asia. He saw himself as the heir to the legacy of Achilles and Heracles, heroes of Greek mythology, and felt a divine mandate to expand his rule across the known world. The first test of his reign came almost immediately. The Greek city-states, always eager to assert their independence, saw his ascension as an opportunity to rebel. Thebes, Athens, and several other cities briefly considered throwing off Macedonian rule. But Alexander, demonstrating his decisiveness and ruthlessness, struck swiftly. He marched into Thebes, crushed the rebellion, and made an example of the city. Thebes was razed to the ground, and its inhabitants were slaughtered or sold into slavery. This brutal response sent a clear message to the rest of Greece: Alexander would not tolerate defiance. But his actions were not purely vengeful, they were calculated. He needed to secure his rule before embarking on the far grander military ventures that lay ahead. The destruction of Thebes would prove to be a key moment in his consolidation of power. Alexander's first major campaign outside Greece, however, was against the Persian Empire. This was where his military genius would truly shine. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with an army of around 35,000 soldiers, beginning his campaign to conquer Asia. The Persian Empire, under King Darius III, seemed invincible, stretching across vast territories from Egypt to India. Darius, a distant ruler with little personal connection to the lands he ruled, had relied on vast, decentralized armies and a network of satraps, governors. He did not have the tight control or the personal drive of Alexander, which would prove to be his downfall. Alexander's first encounter with Persian forces came at the Battle of Granicus, near the coast of Asia Minor. The Persians, confident in their superiority, made the mistake of underestimating Alexander's resolve and tactical brilliance. Despite being outnumbered, Alexander's forces, with their superior discipline and the innovative use of the phalanx, a tight formation of spearmen, struck with devastating speed. The battle was a resounding Macedonian victory, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Persian Empire. But it was not just the victory itself that would have lasting consequences. It was how Alexander conducted the battle. He led from the front, charging directly into the heat of the conflict, risking his own life alongside his men. His bravery was infectious, and it solidified the bond between him and his soldiers. Alexander was not merely a king commanding from a distance. He was a warrior king, willing to face death with his men. In the wake of Granicus, Alexander's campaign gained unstoppable momentum. He marched south through Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities along the way. He didn't just conquer, he positioned himself as a liberator of the Greek people, reclaiming cities that had been subjugated by the Persians. The people of these cities, many of whom had been oppressed for decades, welcomed him with open arms. Alexander was not just a conqueror, he was a symbol of hope and freedom to those who had suffered under Persian rule. As he continued his march south, he reached the city of Gordium, where he famously cut the Gordian knot, a feat that was considered a portent of his destiny. The Gordian knot was a complex knot tied by King Midas of Phrygia, with an oracle claiming that whoever could untie it would rule Asia. Alexander, unable to untie the knot with traditional means, simply cut it with his sword. The symbolic gesture reinforced the idea that Alexander was destined to succeed where others had failed. His approach to problems was as bold and unconventional as his military strategies. By 333 BCE, Alexander reached the heart of the Persian Empire, and the showdown with Darius III was inevitable. The Battle of Issus, fought in the narrow coastal plain near the mouth of the Panaris River, would prove to be a pivotal moment in the campaign. The Persian army, numbering perhaps 100,000, was much larger than Alexander's force, but it was poorly organized and not accustomed to fighting in the type of battle that Alexander preferred. His army was well-trained, disciplined, and motivated, with a singular purpose: to follow their king to glory. In a remarkable display of tactical brilliance, Alexander exploited the terrain and used his forces to their maximum effect. He deployed his cavalry on the flanks to envelop the Persian army, while his infantry drove through the center. Darius III, seeing the tide turn against him, fled the battlefield, leaving his army in disarray. The victory at Issus was a crushing blow to the Persians, and it solidified Alexander's reputation as one of the greatest military strategists in history. It was also the moment when Alexander became more than just a king. He became a legend. As Alexander's army pressed on, the narrative of their conquest took on an almost mythical quality. His victories were not only the result of superior tactics, they were seen as the fulfillment of a divine prophecy. His soldiers, who had followed him from Greece, began to believe that they were invincible, that their king was truly favored by the gods. This belief in divine favor fueled their determination, and Alexander's forces continued to march deeper into Persian territory, unstoppable and unrelenting. But with every victory, the stakes grew higher. Alexander's ambition was no longer just about conquering lands, it was about reshaping the world itself. The further he advanced, the more he realized the magnitude of what lay ahead. His next challenge would be to cross into the heart of the Persian Empire, where the Persian king Darius III awaited, and where a decision would be made that would change the course of history forever. In 332 BCE, Alexander's campaign took him to the coastal city of Tyre, one of the most strategically important cities in the ancient world. Tyre was an island city, surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea, and was renowned for its formidable walls and advanced maritime capabilities. It was also one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world, largely due to its control over trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean. But Tyre, with its strong defenses and strategic location, was not eager to submit to Alexander's growing empire. It would not be a simple conquest, and in the end, it would be a turning point in Alexander's reign, a brutal moment that would define his legacy and set the stage for his increasingly harsh tactics. Tyre's refusal to capitulate to Alexander was not just a military obstacle, it was a personal affront. Alexander had already secured the submission of several key cities along his route, including the powerful Phoenician cities of Sidon and Byblos. These cities, which had long been subject to the Persian Empire, recognized the practical inevitability of Alexander's advance and swiftly swore allegiance to him. Tyre, however, was different. The city's elite, with its strong commercial ties and independent mindset, refused to recognize Alexander's authority even as his army advanced. They were not intimidated by his successes in Asia Minor, nor by the fall of cities such as Gordium. Tyre's rulers were determined to maintain their autonomy and resist what they saw as a foreign conqueror's intrusion into their domain. The siege of Tyre began in the spring of 332 BCE, and from the outset, it was clear that this would not be like the other cities Alexander had conquered. Tyre's position on an island made it nearly invulnerable to traditional siege tactics. The city's defensive walls were formidable, and its navy was powerful, allowing the Tyrians to resupply the city by sea even as Alexander's army began to close in. However, Alexander was not a man easily deterred, and his military ingenuity would come into full force in the siege. The first step in Alexander's plan was to build a causeway, an engineering marvel that would span the gap between the mainland and the island city. This ambitious project would allow Alexander's forces to bring siege engines and troops closer to the walls of Tyre. But building the causeway was not a simple task. The Tyrians, who had seen the Macedonian army approaching, fought back with all their might. They launched frequent naval raids, using their powerful fleet to bombard the construction site and prevent the causeway from being completed. But Alexander's determination was unshaken. Undeterred by the naval assaults, he ordered the construction to continue, reinforcing the causeway with stone and debris from nearby areas. Over several months, the causeway began to take shape, and the Macedonians slowly closed the distance between themselves and the city's walls. As the causeway neared completion, Alexander's forces launched attacks on the city's walls, attempting to breach the defenses with battering rams and siege towers. But the Tyrians fought back fiercely, using their superior knowledge of the sea and their powerful defenses to thwart the Macedonian assault. The defenders fired arrows, hurled stones, and launched burning projectiles at the besiegers, causing significant casualties. Yet, Alexander's resolve remained unwavering. Despite the casualties, despite the setbacks, and despite the growing frustration of his men, he pressed on with a singular focus: Tyre must fall. There could be no compromise. Alexander could not allow a city that dared to resist him to remain independent. As the siege continued, Alexander faced growing pressure to bring the campaign to a swift conclusion. His army had been encamped outside Tyre for months, and morale was beginning to wane. The Tyrians were holding strong, and the heat of the summer was taking its toll on the Macedonian forces. But it was at this point that Alexander made a brutal decision, one that would haunt his reputation for years to come. The tide of the siege began to turn when Alexander ordered the construction of a massive siege tower, equipped with a battering ram, to breach the city's walls. This tower was to be launched at the city's most vulnerable point, but it was clear that only the most desperate tactics would bring the city to its knees. Then came the final blow. Alexander, who had relied on the loyalty of his soldiers and their willingness to follow him into battle, issued an order that would shock even his most loyal commanders. He demanded that the city be taken by any means necessary, including the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians. In a move that would define his reign, Alexander ordered that the inhabitants of Tyre be massacred en masse. This brutal order was carried out swiftly and mercilessly. Once the city was breached, the Macedonian soldiers poured into the streets and began slaughtering the Tyrians, men, women, and children alike. Thousands of civilians were killed, and those who survived were enslaved and sold into bondage. The devastation was unparalleled. Tyre was razed to the ground, its walls torn down, and its magnificent temples burned. The city's wealth, its trade routes, and its culture were destroyed in an act of utter annihilation. The surviving inhabitants were shipped off to other parts of the empire, sold into slavery, while Alexander's men looted the city of its treasures. The psychological impact of this brutality rippled throughout the ancient world. The fall of Tyre was not just a military victory, it was a warning to any city or ruler that dared to defy Alexander's will. It sent a chilling message: Alexander would stop at nothing to achieve his goals, and no city, no matter how powerful or wealthy, would be spared if it stood in his way. But the question remains: why did Alexander, a king who had once been seen as a liberator, resort to such extreme measures? What drove him to massacre thousands and destroy an entire city? Some historians argue that the siege of Tyre was, in fact, a strategic necessity. Tyre's naval power was a threat to Alexander's control over the Mediterranean, and its position on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean made it a key obstacle to his advance into Egypt and beyond. In this light, the brutal actions of Alexander may have been motivated by a desire to eliminate any potential threat to his campaign and solidify his control over the region. Others suggest that Alexander's decision to raise Tyre was more personal. By this point in his campaign, he had already built a reputation as a conqueror who would show no mercy to those who resisted him. His growing arrogance and belief in his divine destiny may have led him to see the fall of Tyre as an essential part of his larger mission: to establish his absolute dominance over the known world. Alexander's unrelenting pursuit of victory, coupled with his belief in his own invincibility, left little room for mercy or compromise. Once he had set his sights on a city, there was no turning back. Whatever the motivations behind the siege, the aftermath was undeniable. Tyre's fall would forever stain Alexander's reputation. Although it was one of his greatest military victories, it came at the cost of his moral authority. It was a victory won not through strategic brilliance alone but through cruelty and terror. And this would become a pattern in Alexander's reign. As he continued his campaign across the Persian Empire and beyond, his actions would grow more ruthless, more severe, and more detached from the values he had once claimed to uphold. The siege of Tyre marked a critical turning point in Alexander's campaign, both militarily and morally. It demonstrated his capacity for absolute ruthlessness in pursuit of his ambitions, and it marked the beginning of a more authoritarian phase of his rule. From Tyre onward, the question of how far Alexander would go in his pursuit of empire would hang over him like a shadow, leaving an indelible mark on his legacy. As Alexander's military campaign continued to unfold, the fierce determination that had propelled him across Asia Minor and through the heart of the Persian Empire began to reveal another side of his character, a ruthlessness that would leave an indelible mark on the ancient world. The Macedonian king, once hailed as a liberator, would soon become known for his willingness to take extreme measures, to make decisions that seemed to abandon the moral considerations that might have guided other rulers. The destruction of Tyre was not an isolated act of cruelty. Rather, it was part of a broader pattern of brutality that would shape the latter part of Alexander's reign, as he began to make orders that would shock even his most loyal soldiers and generals. One of the most brutal and controversial episodes of Alexander's reign occurred during the suppression of a rebellion in the Greek city of Thebes in 335 BC. Though the city was not in the direct path of his conquest, Thebes' revolt posed a serious threat to Alexander's authority in Greece, and it would be an event that would define the trajectory of his empire and solidify his reputation for merciless tactics. Thebes, once one of the most powerful and influential city-states in Greece, had long been a rival to Macedonian dominance. While many of the Greek cities had submitted to Alexander's rule following the death of his father, King Philip II, Thebes had been one of the few holdouts. It had resisted Macedonian control and even joined forces with Athens in the hopes of driving Alexander out of Greece. When Alexander heard of this alliance, his response was swift and unforgiving. He could not afford to let any challenge to his authority go unanswered, especially from a city-state that had once been a thorn in the side of his father's ambitions. Thebes' rebellion, while not large in scale compared to the wars Alexander had fought in Asia, was a direct challenge to his leadership and to the stability of his nascent empire. For Alexander, the rebellion was not just a military threat, it was a test of his power and his resolve. His response to the situation would set the tone for the rest of his rule. While some of his advisors advocated for a more lenient approach, Alexander's decision was clear: the rebellion must be crushed with overwhelming force, and the consequences must be severe enough to serve as a lesson to any other Greek city that might consider defying him. In the winter of 335 BCE, Alexander marched his army toward Thebes, determined to make an example of the city. The Thebans, sensing that they would face the wrath of the Macedonian king, fortified their city and prepared for a siege. However, the Theban defenders were no match for the military might of Alexander's forces. His army, composed of seasoned soldiers and well-trained troops, was unmatched in terms of discipline and strategy. When Alexander arrived outside the city walls, he offered the Thebans a chance to surrender. But Thebes, in a show of defiance, rejected his terms. This was the moment when Alexander, faced with the decision to either negotiate or escalate, chose the latter. In the days that followed, Alexander's siege of Thebes began. His forces encircled the city, cutting off all avenues for escape and resupply. The Macedonian king was determined to break the Thebans' will, and he showed no mercy. His strategy was brutal but effective. The city's walls, though formidable, could not withstand the relentless Macedonian assault. With the help of siege engines, Alexander's forces breached the gates and began to storm the city. What followed was nothing short of horrific. Once inside, Alexander's soldiers began a ruthless campaign of destruction. The Theban defenders fought valiantly, but their resistance was futile. Within hours, the city had fallen, and the Macedonian soldiers set about destroying everything in their path. Homes were burned, the city's temples were desecrated, and the inhabitants were slaughtered. Alexander's orders were clear: there would be no mercy. Thousands of Thebans were killed in the streets, while those who survived were taken as prisoners. In a further act of cruelty, the surviving women and children were sold into slavery, their fates sealed by the actions of their leaders. The city of Thebes was utterly annihilated. The once proud city-state was reduced to rubble, its people either dead or enslaved, its wealth and culture lost forever. The devastation was so complete that many historians have described it as an act of collective punishment, where the entire city was punished for the actions of a few. Alexander's decision to wipe out Thebes was not just a military victory, it was a stark message to the rest of Greece: defy him, and this would be your fate. It was a message that reverberated throughout the Greek world, spreading fear and awe in equal measure. But the question remains: why did Alexander go to such extremes? What drove him to execute such a harsh and unforgiving campaign against Thebes? Some argue that his decision was driven by political necessity. As the new king of Macedon, he needed to consolidate his power in Greece and establish his authority over the other city-states. Thebes, with its long-standing resistance to Macedonian rule, was a symbol of defiance that could not be allowed to continue. By making an example of the city, Alexander ensured that no other Greek city would dare challenge his authority.